Job chapter 40. We're going to read a chunk of chapter 40 and a chunk of chapter 41. But it's not that many verses and they're good, so we'll be all right. Job chapter 40, starting at verse 15. This is God speaking, and God says, "Look at the behemoth which I made along with you, and which feeds on the grass like an ox. What strength he has in his loins, what power in the muscles of his belly. His tail sways like a cedar, the sinews of his thighs are close knit. His bones are like tubes of bronze, his limbs like rods of iron. He ranks first among the works of God, yet his maker can approach him with the sword. The hills bring him their produce, and the wild animals play nearby. Under the lotus plant he lies, hidden among the reeds in the marsh. The lotuses conceal him in their shadows. The poplars by the stream surround him. When the river rages, he is not alarmed. He is secure, though the Jordan should surge against his mouth. Can anyone capture him by the eyes, or trap him and pierce his nose? Can you pull in the Leviathan with a fishhook, or tie down his tongue with a rope? Can you put a cord through his nose or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he keep begging you for mercy? Will he speak to you with gentle words? Will he make an agreement with you for you to take him as your slave for life? Can you make a pet of him like a bird, or put him on a leash for your girls? Will traders barter for him? Will they divide him up among the merchants? Can you fill his hide with harpoons, or his head with fishing spears? If you lay a hand on him, you will remember the struggle and never do it again. Any hope of subduing him is false. The mere sight of him is overpowering. No one is fierce enough to rouse him. Who then is able to stand against me? Who has a claim against me that I must pay? Everything under heaven belongs to me." The word of the Lord. One of my fondest childhood memories was in May of 1999 when Star Wars Episode 1 was released in theaters. This puts me at the end of like 7th grade. I had grown up watching the original Star Wars trilogy with my dad, and so I was over the moon with excitement at the promise of my own Star Wars movies when I could look back and say, yeah, I stood in line and waited to go see that one in the theater. I was ecstatic for the promise of a new set of Star Wars films, to the point where I think that summer I saw that movie like 10 times in the theater. No one should be surprised by that, I don't think. Anyways, there's one scene at the beginning of this movie where the two main Jedi characters have to travel through the planet core. And in order to do that, it involved taking this little ship through this underwater voyage, through tunnels and around rock outcroppings and various things. Anyways, the prospect of that trip scared the pants off of the character who was their guide throughout this trip. And his fear turned out to be well-founded, because shortly after they leave on this voyage, they begin to be chased by this huge computer-generated fish-type creature who threatens to eat their little craft. At least that is until a larger, another secondary CGI character swims up and eats that fish. When they finally realize that they are safe and they're not going to be eaten by this computer-generated character, the wise mentor Jedi character says one line that has stuck with me. He says, "There's always a bigger fish." And it proves to be a little prophetic, because the exact same thing happens only seconds later when once again they are threatened to be eaten by a computer-generated fish character that is then eaten by an even bigger computer-generated fish character. But that line kept popping into my head as I looked over this text this past week. The idea that there's always a bigger fish. And that's certainly true in our lives, right? This is our experience, that there's always a bigger problem around the corner. There's always a bigger bully. There's always a higher authority figure. There's always another person that has more of whatever than we do. A bigger house, more cars, a bigger truck, more toys. In our experience, there's always somebody more powerful than us. And we can follow that step all the way up until we get to God. Because there is nothing bigger and more powerful in this universe than God. And we know that. And I think Job probably knew that too. But Job doesn't grasp the vastness of who God is until really after this part of the book that we read together. Until it's presented to him in an incredibly profound way. We're going to kind of take a look at Job's journey to that realization this morning as we dive into this text a bit deeper together. Now, the character of Job is introduced all the way back in chapter 1 of the book that bears his name. And we are told right off that Job was blameless and upright, that he feared God and shunned evil. And that's really all we get about his person. But it's enough for us to say with confidence that Job was a pretty good guy. He was upstanding and moral. He very likely believed in God and followed the law as best as he was able, probably making him righteous in that way. Job has a big family. He's got a wife, he's got 7 sons and 3 daughters. And on top of all of that, the beginning of chapter 1 also tells us that Job is absolutely loaded. This is a time before wealth was measured in hard coin. Job had livestock coming out of his ears. He had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke or pair of oxen, 500 donkeys, and he had all sorts of servants on top of that to take care of his various interests. Job is absolutely an amazing figure for that point in history. In fact, verse 3 tells us outright that he was the greatest man among all of the people of the East. And the rest of the book is essentially the story of what happens to Job. And unfortunately, it's not a very good story. The main narrative portion takes place in the rest of chapter 1 and chapter 2. Where the scene shifts to a heavenly dialogue between God and Satan, where God agrees to allow Satan to test Job and to prove that Job doesn't have the faith just because of the blessings he has been given. So Satan systematically then destroys everything that Job has. His oxen and donkeys are stolen and their caretakers killed. His sheep are burned by fire from heaven along with their caretakers. His camels are stolen and those caretakers also killed. And to top it all off, a house collapses on his entire family and none of his 10 children survive. Flipping the page into chapter 2, Job's story gets no better at all because now Satan is allowed to afflict Job himself and gives him painful sores all over his body. And we watch as Job goes from the greatest man to the most wretched man in the span of only 2 chapters. Where he once had everything at the end of chapter 2, and he now has nothing, and he is sitting in ashes, scraping at himself with shards of pottery for some reason. And that's not even the end of the story. There are 40 more chapters to this book, which by and large consist of really long speeches by Job and 4 of his friends. 3 of these friends work very hard to try to convince Job that what is happening to him is God's judgment, that Job has done something wrong and needs to repent. Job, however, maintains his innocence throughout. He insists that he's done nothing to deserve this kind of treatment, that it is all coming from God to him for no reason at all. A number of different times, he even calls on God to directly answer for what is happening to Job. His 4th friend, Elihu, cautions Job on how he's speaking because God is the source of wisdom. But really, if we look through this whole book, we quickly learn that Job's only desire isn't to die and get his suffering over with. It's not really even for his suffering to end. Job's only desire through this whole story is that God explain to him why this is all happening. In the face of all of these terrible things, Job wants God to show up so he can give Job an answer. Job spends his speeches demanding an answer to what's going on from the Almighty. Because Job knows, beyond a shadow of a doubt, as does the reader, that he has done nothing to deserve this kind of treatment. Job feels as if he deserves an explanation and demands that God appear before him and give him that explanation. And oh man, is that a question or a demand or a feeling that we know a thing or two about. How many times in our lives have we demanded that God show up and explain to us what's going on, especially after something bad happens? We want God to give us an answer, to give us a clear, black and white explanation as to why that situation had to happen. The classic example of this is the loss of a loved one. Especially if that loss was incredibly sudden or surprising or particularly sad. Survivors in those situations can be mad, or they can be angry, or they can be furious, or they can simply just be riddled with grief. But whatever it is, it causes them to cry out to God with questions like, why in the world would you do this to me now? Why did you have to take this one away? Why is this the path that my life is taking? Some of the same questions that Job demanded God answer are ones that we want answers to as well. Because a lot of times the situations we find ourselves in don't make sense. Another example of how this works out is when things don't go according to plan. Especially when we feel like the things that we're doing are the right things. When we feel like what we're doing is what God wants us to do. Maybe there's an outreach event that didn't work quite right. Or we're watching a church that we love be in decline for a number of years. Maybe we've raised our children, but it's still not gone the way we hoped. Maybe our lives aren't working out even though we have decided to do or not do certain things that we thought God wanted us to do or not do. We can feel like what we're doing is right, and yet time and time again still see our efforts fall flat on their faces. And it makes us want to cry out to God, come on, I'm doing the right thing. I am doing what you want me to do. Why is this still happening? Why aren't you making me successful? This is what you want, isn't it? Why is it not working out for me? A third example is the low-hanging fruit of the year, and that's the pandemic that has characterized and will forever characterize 2020. We've seen people get sick. We've seen people die. We've seen good people get sick and die. And we've watched as other good people have stood by and experienced that loss. Everything we planned for the entire year got postponed, including a lot of good things that would have helped a lot of people. And as this force has destroyed our normal, God's people are asking in droves, God, why won't you stop it? Why is this still happening 9 months on? Why are we still being afflicted with this disease? And regardless of why we're asking why, all of these questions are made more complicated because we know that God has an answer. We know that God knows why all of this stuff has been happening to us. We know that God has the power to stop it. That's the picture that Scripture paints of our all-powerful sovereign God. So then why do things happen to us the way they do? Why does God not just snap his fingers and stop it? Now, theologians have a fancy word for this particular line of questioning, because of course they do. It's called theodicy, and it's the search for God's goodness in the face of suffering. And books and books and books and books have been written on that particular topic. And they address some of the possible options or possible answers to the question of why. One possible answer is that we deserve it. That the human condition is so bad, that type of evil in our lives is what we deserve. Evil is so rampant, so why would we expect anything other than evil in our lives? A second possible answer is that we have done something wrong and we are being punished. This was the answer that Job's friends put forward in most of their speeches. That there is something that we have done that we have not repented of, and so we will be punished until such time as we tell God we're sorry. A third answer is that God simply doesn't care, that we are not actually as important to him as we have come to think. Now, all of these answers and more have been offered up as reasons why bad things happen to good people. Thankfully, none of them have held up under scrutiny, which is good for us. And that's what a lot of the books and books and books about this type of thing are about. So then maybe there's another answer out there. Maybe there's something else, something that we don't know or that we can't see. And as it turns out, that's exactly what Job discovers. Because after several chapters of speeches, God shows up. Elihu, Job's fourth friend, the only one who's really kind of got a grasp of what's going on here, finishes up comparing God's power to that of a storm, only for God to show up in chapter 38, verse 1, in a storm, and actually comes down and answers Job. In fact, God talks to Job out of that storm for 2 chapters, basically saying, "Who are you, you puny little man? Where were you when I created the world? Have you done the things that I have done? Do you have the ability to make things the way that they are?" Which, if you think about it, is a pretty terrifying speech, especially coming from the voice of God out of a powerful storm. And Job has the opportunity to answer, actually. The beginning of chapter 40, verses 4 and 5, Job says, "I am unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more." Which I take to be the biblical equivalent of Job going, like that. Because he is nervous at this point. God does not seem to be too terribly happy with the demands that Job has been making. And then God really gets into it. Verse 7, he says, "Brace yourself like a man, and I will question you, and you will answer me." Essentially, God, speaking out of this storm, saying, get ready for it. And then we get into our text, where God says to Job, "You want me to talk? I'll talk. Consider these mighty beasts." And then God says the section of the passage that we read for this morning. First, he deals with the behemoth, which is this strange creature. I guess the Hebrew word here is actually the plural of the word beast. So it's generally agreed upon that this is what they've called a plural of magnificence, which is them saying that this particular beast is so amazing that we're going to refer to it as a collective group of beasts. And it might be a hippopotamus, but nobody's quite sure. Whatever it is, it's big, it's strong, it's beyond the capability of pretty much anything at all to tame, and it's certainly more than a normal human can stand against under their own power. The second beast is even cooler than that, and it's the Leviathan. And God talks about this one for a long time. Leviathan is probably a crocodile, but the Egyptians were pretty good at capturing and subduing crocodiles, and the Leviathan is presented as an animal that no one can tame. And then, of course, the crocodile thing goes out the window if we were to keep reading, because in verses 19, 20, and 21, it all of a sudden starts to breathe fire like a dragon. So anyways, God speaks about these 2 great beasts, one that is the greatest of all the land animals, and one that's the greatest of all the sea creatures. And through this whole list of rhetorical questions, God points out to Job that Job would have no chance to stand in front of a beast like that. But that God, and God alone, can. God could treat these great beasts as if they were house pets. because he is more powerful than they are, because he is their master. And Job learns, as God speaks terrifyingly from within this storm, that God really and truly is the bigger fish, that there is nothing more powerful than him. The one that Job has been demanding answers to this whole time is so much more powerful than he's ever realized. The entire book of Job could be boiled down to one sentence: I am God, and you are not. And Job gets the idea, when God is finished speaking, that there is more at stake here than he realizes, puny little man that he is. And also, that in spite of what's happened to Job up to this point, God has everything under control. And that, frankly, is our lesson for 2020, for our lives in general, that God is in control and that he is always the most powerful in any situation. That he is God and we are not. It's one thing to know that in our heads, but another thing to realize in our hearts. You see, for most things we can see from our point of view. Maybe if we work at it, we can see from the point of view of someone else. But we can't see from God's point of view. We can't pull back that far as his creation, because after all, he is God and we are not. But if we could, we would realize quickly that God's plan is so much bigger, so much more all-encompassing than we realize, that there is so much going on in God's plan that we don't even know a quarter of it. Now, is that particularly comforting? Probably not. Job demands answers from God, and God shows up in a storm and says, "Consider the hippo." Not the most comforting of replies. So no, a realization of God's greatness might not be what we're looking for when we ourselves are facing tragedy. That might not give us the answers we want. If I'm at a graveside service with a family as they're saying their final goodbyes, it's not going to be that comforting for me to say, well, God's bigger than you. As a people, when our worlds are turned upside down, it's not that comforting for someone to stick their head in and say, hey, let's talk about a hippopotamus for a little bit. Yet clearly it had some effect on Job, because Job responds to God one more time. Chapter 42, verses 2 and 3, Job says, I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. You asked, who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? And here he says it. Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. Job did not get the answers he wanted. Job was not particularly comforted in his plight. He was probably more scared than anything else. But he had a realization at that moment of how much power God has in any situation, of God's ultimate sovereignty and control over everything. And it humbles him. And that's really what it should do to us as well. Because also, notice this, Job doesn't sin in this book. I mean, he does because he's an imperfect human being. But we are told explicitly several times in chapters 1 and 2 that Job does not sin in what he says. In his speeches, he does not sin in what he says. So for us, there's nothing wrong in asking God why these things are happening, or even getting a little upset at God because of where we find ourselves. But like Job, we have to have that humble realization that we are not, in fact, owed anything by God, including answers to all of our questions. God is more powerful than we can ever imagine. God is the ultimate bigger fish, and he doesn't owe us a single thing. However, we also can realize through all of this that we can rely on God for the exact same reason. In every situation, God is always the one in control. Even if we don't know the answer to the question of why, it is comforting for us to realize that God has it well in hand. Comfort lies in the fact that even though 100% of our questions are not answered all the time, God uses his power to demonstrate his undying faithfulness. This is actually evidenced still in the book of Job, at the end of chapter 42, the last 10 verses, where Job has everything restored back to him and then some. Job has more children. He has another 10 kids. And he amasses, this time, 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 pair of oxen, 1,000 donkeys. Now, these probably did not replace the family and possessions that he lost at the beginning. Still, they are blessings from God in unheard of quantities. God uses his power over Job's situation to bless Job with immense wealth once again. That same God is still faithful today. God still uses his power to demonstrate his faithfulness. We saw that when we gathered together to celebrate the birth of Jesus Christ on Christmas. That God sent his son Jesus into the world to die that we might live is one of the ultimate expressions of God's power and God's faithfulness. But we see that in smaller ways too, in comfort when we're sad, in provision when we're in need, in giving of opportunities and guiding when we're lost or gone astray. God's provision, God's power, God's sovereignty doesn't always show up in the way we expect or the way we want. But regardless, God is always in control, God is always sovereign, and God always has his people well in hand.